What happens when an elderly man accidentally scratches a luxury car and his life takes a surprising turn? What if the key to making things right isn't money or anger, but something much more valuable? Stay tuned, because this is a story that will make you think twice about respect, responsibility, and the power of compassion. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more heartwarming stories like this one. The sun had not yet risen, and a soft light of early morning spread across a small town. In an old kitchen of a house with a slanted roof, there was Mr. Johnson, a 60-year-old man, busy getting ready for the day. His thin, weathered hands carefully arranged freshly picked vegetables from his backyard garden into a large basket. The fresh green spinach, bright purple eggplants, and a few small zucchinis were neatly placed, ready for him to take to the market and sell. Mr. Johnson's life wasn't easy. At his age, he should have been resting, but he still wanted to work, to keep busy and make some money to help support his children. He often reminded himself of this when people told him to relax. He lived alone in his small home. His wife had passed away many years ago, and his children worked far away. Every morning, he woke up early, loaded his old bicycle with the basket of vegetables, and headed to the market. For him, the market wasn't just about making money. It was a place where he could talk to others and connect with the community. That morning, like every other day, Mr. Johnson double-checked the basket of vegetables, placed it on his old bicycle, and rode off down the road. The early morning chill gently touched his wrinkled face, but his heart still felt warm. As he passed the main street near the market, Mr. Johnson carefully steered his bike past the tightly parked cars. Suddenly, just as he was about to turn into a small alley, his bicycle wobbled. A loud crash startled him. The bike lost its balance, and the basket of vegetables tumbled over. Some bundles of greens and a few tomatoes rolled into the street. Turning around, he saw a shiny black car parked nearby, with a large scratch clearly visible on the side. For a moment, Mr. Johnson stood frozen, his heart racing, not from pain but from fear. The car looked very expensive, and he knew he had just made a big mistake. "Oh no, how did I end up hitting such an expensive car?" Mr. Johnson mumbled, his hands shaking as he began picking up the scattered vegetables. While he was still flustered, the car door suddenly swung open, and a young man in a suit stepped out, his face filled with anger. He looked at the scratch on his car, then turned to Mr. Johnson. "Old man, what do you think you're doing?" he yelled, his voice drawing the attention of people nearby. Mr. Johnson lowered his head and said softly, "Young man, I didn't mean to. I'm really sorry. I'll pay for the damage." "Pay? Do you think you can afford it? Do you even know how much this car costs?" The young man interrupted angrily, his voice getting louder. People walking by started to stop and watch the argument. Mr. Johnson's face turned red with embarrassment and worry. He quickly replied, "I'm truly sorry, young man. My bike just slipped. Please tell me how much it will cost to fix the car, and I'll try to gather the money to pay for it." But his apology seemed to make the young man even angrier. The man stepped closer, pointing at Mr. Johnson's face. "Gather money? How long do you think it will take you to get enough? This is your fault, and you have to take responsibility. You're old. Shouldn't you be at home resting instead of coming out here and causing trouble?" Those words hit Mr. Johnson hard, like a sharp sting. He could only bow his head, his trembling hands picking up the fallen vegetables and broken tomatoes. Just when things were about to get worse, a woman's voice came from behind. "What's all the noise about? If there's a problem, talk it out calmly. Why are you shouting at this elderly man?" Everyone turned to look. A graceful, well-dressed woman stepped out of a car parked behind the scene. Her sharp eyes showed both seriousness and calmness. She walked forward, her designer handbag hanging on her arm and her high heels tapping against the pavement. The woman quickly scanned the situation. An expensive car with a scratch, an elderly man picking up his vegetables, and a crowd of curious people watching. She frowned slightly, her voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" The young man who had been yelling at Mr. Johnson turned to face the woman. His expression immediately softened, and he spoke respectfully. "Ma'am, this old man scratched your car with his bicycle. I was just handling it." "Handling it by shouting at him?" she asked, her piercing gaze showing her disapproval. The young man looked uncomfortable and didn't say anything more. Seeing this, the woman turned to Mr. Johnson, her tone becoming gentler. "Sir, are you all right? Are you hurt anywhere?" Mr. Johnson looked up, his eyes red from the stress and embarrassment. He shook his head, his voice shaking. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm fine. I just accidentally scratched the car. I'm really sorry, truly sorry." The woman looked at Mr. Johnson for a moment, then nodded slightly. Her expression softened, though she still carried a sense of authority as she turned back to the young driver. "The car is scratched, but it's not a big deal. Why did you yell at him like that? Don't you know how to act? He's an elderly man and accidents happen. We need to resolve this, but not by treating an old man badly." The driver lowered his head and muttered, "I'm sorry, ma'am. I lost my temper." The woman sighed and shook her head, clearly disappointed. She then turned to the crowd. "Please, everyone, don't just stand here. I'll handle this situation." The bystanders began to move away, though most only stepped back a little, still watching the conversation closely. Turning back to Mr. Johnson, the woman gave him a small smile. "Sir, please stay calm. I'm not the type to make a big deal over a small scratch. But could you tell me exactly what happened so I can understand better?" Mr. Johnson let out a sigh of relief. He felt comforted by her words. He bowed his head and explained, "This morning I was going to the market early. My bike slipped, and I accidentally hit your car. I didn't mean to, really. If you need to fix the car, I'll try to get the money together. I know it's my fault." The woman listened carefully, nodding occasionally but never interrupting him. When Mr. Johnson finished, she smiled gently. "Sir, you don't need to worry. I can see you're honest and taking responsibility. The car only has a minor scratch. There's no need to make a big deal out of it." However, the young driver still seemed upset and spoke up. "But ma'am, it's still his fault. If we let it go too easily, what will others think? What if someone else damages the car and thinks an apology is enough?" The woman's face turned serious and her voice grew firm. "That's enough. Yes, he's at fault. But you can't speak to an elderly man like that. Do you even know how old he is? Do you know what it means to respect our elders?" Her words cut through the tension, and the young driver immediately fell silent. The crowd around them began to murmur, their eyes shifting from sympathy for Mr. Johnson to admiration for the woman. One person in the crowd spoke up, "She's absolutely right. It's rare to see anyone show respect for the elderly these days." Hearing this, Mr. Johnson felt a mix of relief and guilt for causing the scene. He hesitated before adding, "Thank you so much for understanding, ma'am. But it's still my fault. Please just tell me how much it'll cost to fix the car, and I'll try my best to pay." Before he could finish, the woman raised her hand, signaling him to stop. "There's no need for that, sir. I don't need any money for the repair. But do you have children or grandchildren? Could you call them here so we can talk about how to handle this situation?" Mr. Johnson nodded and pulled out an old phone from his pocket, his hands trembling. He dialed a number and spoke softly. "James, it's me, your father. Come quickly to the main road near the market. I've run into a little problem and need your help." On the other end, his son's voice was filled with concern. "What happened, Dad? Are you okay? I'll be there right away." After hanging up, the woman smiled calmly and said, "Let's wait for your son to arrive and then we can figure out what to do. Don't worry, there's always a way to resolve things." Mr. Johnson nodded slightly, feeling a bit more at ease. However, he had no idea that his son's arrival would bring an unexpected twist to the situation. Less than 20 minutes after Mr. Johnson's phone call, a motorbike sped toward the scene. The rider was James, Mr. Johnson's only son. James stopped the bike quickly, took off his helmet, and rushed over to the crowd gathered around the expensive car. "Dad, are you okay? Are you hurt anywhere?" he asked, his face full of concern as he checked his father over. Mr. Johnson shook his head and spoke in a low, troubled voice. "I'm fine, but I accidentally scratched someone's car. I apologized, but the driver insists I must pay for the repairs. I called you because I don't know what to do." James turned to look at the car. The long scratch on its shiny surface was clear. But what stood out to him even more was the driver's unpleasant attitude. The driver frowned, ready to argue, but the woman standing nearby quickly raised her hand to stop him. She looked at James with calm yet sharp eyes and asked, "Are you his son?" James nodded, his face still tense, and replied, "Yes, I'm his son. This is my father, and while he made a mistake, I don't understand why he's being treated like this. My father, but your driver's attitude was excessive. Are you the owner of the car? If you want the car repaired, I'm willing to pay, but I won't accept my father being treated like this." The woman smiled softly, her expression gentle but wise. She spoke calmly. "Please calm down. I'm the owner of the car, not the driver. I don't intend to make your father feel bad. He has apologized sincerely, and I don't think this is something worth making a big fuss over." Her words acted like a splash of cold water, calming James's anger. He fell silent, looking at her closely before nodding. "If that's the case, I apologize. But my father will still take responsibility. We'll pay for the repairs." Mr. Johnson quickly grabbed his son's arm, speaking anxiously. "James, I've told you I didn't do it on purpose. She's not trying to make things difficult, don't be so tense." But James kept his serious expression. He turned to the woman, his eyes full of determination. "My father made a mistake, and I don't want him to be seen as someone who caused trouble and didn't take responsibility. You can tell me the repair cost, and I will pay." The woman smiled lightly and shook her head. "You seem like an honest and responsible person, but I'll say it again, this isn't necessary. The scratch isn't worth fixing. What's more important is the attitude of the people here, and that's what we should focus on." She turned to look at the driver, her gaze turning cold. "You know I don't like people who act disrespectfully. I've told you many times, never treat the elderly with arrogance. You've disappointed me." The driver lowered his head, not daring to say anything more. The atmosphere grew quiet. Suddenly, the woman turned back to Mr. Johnson and gently bent down to pick up the fallen vegetables. "These are the products of your hard work. Let me compensate you for them. The eggs and vegetables are spoiled, right?" Mr. Johnson quickly waved his hand and shook his head. No need for that, ma'am. I've already scratched your car, and now you want to compensate me? That's really unnecessary." But the woman remained firm. She took a large bill from her wallet and handed it to Mr. Johnson. "Please take it. This isn't for the repair of the car, it's for compensating your hard work. You can think of it as me buying these vegetables and eggs." The crowd around them murmured in surprise. Some admired the woman's kindness, while others were taken aback by the way she handled the situation. James stood there, feeling his heart soften. He bowed his head and said to the woman, "Thank you for not making things difficult for my father. I was too hot-headed today, and I hope you can forgive me." The woman smiled and responded in a gentle yet meaningful voice, "It's nothing. I just hope both you and the driver can learn a lesson. Never let anger overpower the respect you should show others, especially the elderly. The world is already chaotic enough. A little kindness can make everything better." Her words made both James and the crowd fall silent as they reflected on her message. Just when it seemed the matter was settled, the woman looked at Mr. Johnson one last time and said, "You are a good person. You've taught your son a lesson in responsibility and humanity. I really appreciate that." Her words were like a warm light for Mr. Johnson's heart. But he didn't know that this wasn't the end of the surprises in this story. After everything seemed to calm down, the woman turned to look at Mr. Johnson and James. Her eyes were thoughtful, as though she was considering something. Finally, she gave a gentle smile, one full of meaning, and slowly spoke. "Sir, I don't want to cause trouble for you or your son, but there are a few things I'd like to say before I leave." Both Mr. Johnson and James were surprised. They listened with respect, while the crowd around them also seemed reluctant to leave. The woman continued, her voice soft yet full of emotion. "Actually, I understand your situation very well because my family was once poor too. I grew up in a small town and saw my mother selling vegetables at the market to support us. Every time she encountered problems, I always wondered why people were so cold to hard workers like her. When I grew older, I promised myself I would never forget those days, and I would never let anyone's dignity be hurt because of material things." Her words made not only Mr. Johnson, but also the crowd fall silent. Some people started whispering to each other, their eyes filled with admiration for the woman. "This car may be very expensive, but it's not more important than human compassion." A scratch on the car is nothing compared to the value of respect for the elderly or empathy for hard-working people like your father. He has already apologized, and that is enough. No compensation is necessary. She looked directly into James's eyes and continued, "You are a good son, protecting your father. But sometimes, instead of getting angry, we need to learn to communicate calmly. Your father has taught you a lesson about responsibility, but I think today you should also learn a lesson in patience and listening." James remained silent, feeling her words deeply. He lowered his head slightly and quietly said, "Thank you, I will remember that." Unexpectedly, the woman turned to the driver. Her gaze became even more serious. "You work for me, but your attitude today has greatly disappointed me. I don't need a good driver. I need someone who knows how to respect and empathize with others. Remember, if you continue to act like you did today, you won't have a place working with me." The driver bowed his head, speaking softly. "I'm sorry. I'll learn from this experience." The woman gave a slight nod and turned back to Mr. Johnson and James. She took a business card from her handbag and handed it to James. "If you need any help with work or anything else, feel free to call me. I'm always happy to assist those with determination and kindness." James awkwardly took the business card, read it, and was surprised to find that she was the CEO of a large company in the city. She smiled lightly. "Don't be surprised, I'm just someone who has been through hardships and understands the value of kindness." Finally, she gave a slight bow to Mr. Johnson, then got into her car. Before closing the door, she added, "I hope your life continues to go well. Please take care of your health and keep living as you always have." The car slowly drove away from the scene. The crowd began to disperse, but their eyes were still filled with admiration for the woman who had just left. Mr. Johnson looked at the business card in James's hand, sighed with relief and smiled. "Do you see? There are still many good people in this world. She really understands things." James nodded, his eyes filled with respect. He suddenly realized that life isn't just about responsibility and pressure, but also about kindness and valuable lessons from people we meet by chance. As the luxury car disappeared into the distance, the space seemed to grow quieter. Mr. Johnson stood there, his gaze following the direction of the woman who had just left. A sense of gratitude and relief filled his heart. James turned to his father, carefully picking up the remaining bundles of vegetables from the ground, and spoke in a softer voice than before. "Dad, today I was wrong. I was too hot-headed and didn't think things through." James looked at his father, feeling deeply moved. If it weren't for her, I'm afraid things would have gone much further. Mr. Johnson smiled warmly, his eyes full of compassion. "It's good that you realize that now. You don't always have to use a firm tone to solve problems, especially when you don't fully understand the other person." James bowed his head in silence, deep in thought. It seemed like he had not only learned a lesson from the woman, but also come to understand the importance of calmness and respect in every situation. The crowd around them began to disperse, but the story of Mr. Johnson and the woman continued to be the talk of the area. An elderly woman selling goods nearby looked at Mr. Johnson with a fond expression. "You're very lucky to have met such a good person. I've lived here for many years, and it's rare to see someone wealthy who is so kind. If there were more people like her, life would be so much easier." Another man added, "Exactly. She not only taught her driver how to respect others, but also made us, the witnesses, reflect on our own actions." Mr. Johnson felt warm inside, but also a little shy. He nodded and thanked them before turning back to James. "All right, let's finish gathering the vegetables. This is over now. We need to get back to work." James nodded and began helping his father organize the remaining items. Despite the busy work, his mind was still preoccupied with the business card the woman had left behind. That evening, as they sat at the old wooden table in their small house, James took the card and looked at it again. The woman's name was Sarah Williams, CEO of Williams Enterprises. James fell into deep thought, then turned to his father. "Dad, she said if I ever need anything, I should contact her. Do you think I should try reaching out?" Mr. Johnson looked surprised, then nodded thoughtfully. "Why not? But remember, no one can help you forever. Give yourself a chance. You must work with your own ability and kindness." The next morning, James decided to call the number on the business card. After a brief conversation, he was invited to meet Mrs. Sarah Williams at her office for a discussion. With sincerity and a positive attitude, James quickly secured a job at her corporation in a role that perfectly matched his skills. As time passed, Mr. Johnson's life remained simple, but his smile grew brighter. James, on the other hand, matured not only in his work, but also in how he interacted with others. He learned the importance of patience, listening, and valuing the small yet precious things in life. Whenever he met his father, he would share the new lessons he learned from work and the kind colleagues he met. He often mentioned Mrs. Williams, the woman who had changed his life and helped him realize the value of empathy and kindness. The story of the noble woman, the old man selling vegetables, and the driver became a cherished tale shared in the market. It was often recounted as a lesson in humanity, civility, and kindness. One peaceful morning, while Mr. Johnson sat on the porch sipping hot tea, he smiled when he saw a car pull up in front of his house. The person stepping out was none other than Mrs. Sarah Williams. "Hello, I was passing by and thought I'd stop by to visit you," she said. Mr. Johnson invited her inside, and they chatted about life and the simple yet beautiful things. Before leaving, Mrs. Williams left him with a thought that he would always remember. "You know, kindness is like a seed, if you plant it in the right place, where it will sprout and spread, and that day, you were the one who planted that seed in my heart and the hearts of those around me." Mr. Johnson sat silently, watching Mrs. Williams's figure fade into the distance. A strange warmth filled his heart. Perhaps, no matter how difficult life may be, as long as we maintain kindness and empathy, things will eventually get better. If this story inspired you, remember that kindness and respect can turn any situation around. Let's make the world a better place by showing compassion every day. Don't forget to share this story with others, hit the like button, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Join us on this journey to spread positivity and make every moment count.